Hello, welcome back to the fourth film in this series about the history of runes and runic culture. I would advise you to watch the films in sequence because otherwise it's like doing a jigsaw puzzle with some of the pieces missing. You won't get the full picture. Okay, so we have talked about the history of runes in general, when they were used, who was using them, and what they were using them for. And today, in this film, I want to look at the question of how do we know about the culture of the Germanic peoples and what do we know about their magical practices? Have you ever wondered how we know about these old lost languages and how we can read them? How can we read what the Vikings wrote or the Anglo Saxons or the Franks? For me, this is a totally fascinating subject. If we go back to those antiquarians I was talking about in the previous film, right, from the 18th century, they suddenly developed this interest in trying to find this lost northern culture and to piece it together and recreate it, rather than the general classical culture, which is what is prevalent at the time. So these guys start collecting old manuscripts and books, but by this time, a lot of the languages that these things are written in are lost and forgotten in time. How did they get to read these books? Before we consider how they could read them, I wanted to consider why the books are even in existence. Where did they come from? Well, we have the church to thank for that, because it was the church that was collecting and creating these old manuscripts. So not all churchmen were the book-burning haters of pagan culture that we sometimes think of. So the church preserved old manuscripts, and some of these dated way back into the pagan period. Often literate monks or priests, or in Iceland, just educated literate men, used to copy these manuscripts and collect them. So throughout the Middle Ages, there was this production of manuscripts. Otherwise, if it hadn't been for this, we wouldn't have any of the classical writings of the Greeks, of the Romans, of the later people. It's because these churchmen and other interested people were copying them down and collecting them. When the books started to rot with age, they made some more. They copied them again, and they passed them amongst themselves, and libraries in different places built up, which gave more chance of old manuscripts surviving. We have references to classical authors where they talk about books that have been lost, and we only know that they existed because they're talked about in other books. So it gives you an idea of how much stuff has been lost. But anyway, if they hadn't have done this, we wouldn't have anything left from our medieval or our classical past. I think it's pretty frightening to think about how much has been lost through the ages in fires or destructive moments of history. But luckily for us, some things have survived. And from those early times, from the migration period and the early Middle Ages, we have just fragments of stuff left. But these enable us to grasp at this lost culture of our Germanic ancestors. Okay. Back to the antiquarians. As I said, they're developing an interest in this old culture of the north, and they're getting these manuscripts together and they're copying them themselves and they're publishing them. But as I said, these manuscripts, ones they're digging out of old church libraries or storage places, often they're in languages that they can't even read anymore. This brings about the birth of philology. Now, philology is a study of old languages. It's people who study the fragments of languages that are left and link them together and connect them to modern languages, and therefore enable us to read these old lost languages. Some of these languages, they only survive as a page torn from an old book. Some of them actually are literally burnt around the edges. But thanks to philology, we can read them again and we get these fragments back. Some of the fragments are nothing more than runic inscriptions scratched on war booty thrown in a lake somewhere in Denmark in the 2nd century after a battle. I mean, it's that scarce sometimes. But let me give you an example of these old languages and how they can survive. Gothic. So the Goths were a tribe originating in Sweden, and they migrated across Europe, and by the 4th century CE, they end up around the area of the Crimea, and they're in contact with the Romans. In fact, we know about them because Roman historians wrote about the Goths. In fact, the Goths were so influential that even the Vikings, hundreds of years later, were still telling stories about the Goths. Anyway, they were Christianized, and the Gospels were translated into Gothic. And through an accident of history, these 4 Gospels in Gothic survive. So philologists can piece together the Gothic language, and we can read it once again. Where am I? Hold on. Okay, yeah, so other languages that we still have in books. The Anglo Saxons left us stuff. They leave quite a lot of writings. A lot of it's religious, but some of it is riddles or old tales or even healing charms and spells. We've got quite a lot of stuff in Old Norse because the Vikings were writing down poems. Even more obscure languages like Old High German survives in fragments of manuscripts. So, because of the work of these philologists and these old antiquarians, we can understand and read these precious fragments of our past. Okay, if we're going to look at runic magic, then we better consider first of all, what do we actually know about the magical practices of the Germanic people? Most of our evidence in terms of actual written descriptions comes from the Vikings. When I say Viking, I mean the Scandinavian peoples from the 8th to 11th centuries. But because we're comparing Germanic cultures, we can look at the stuff left by the Vikings and we can make educated guesses about how other Germanic peoples were practicing magic. So there are 2 kinds of magic. The first kind is Seidr. The other kind is called Gauder. Now, Seidr is a form of shamanism. It's like where you control spirits if you want to achieve an effect, like telling the future or cursing someone or curing someone. It's control of spirits. And in the Viking Age, this is predominantly a woman's magic. In fact, it is the ancestor of witchcraft. Men did practice it, but it was considered something shameful at that time. Probably, or almost certainly, because it involved sexual rituals that were considered shameful for men to take part in. We don't know a lot about Seidr. Not a lot of it is written down, perhaps because it was so secretive, or perhaps because the kind of people who were writing down manuscripts at that time didn't like it and didn't write about it. The other type of magic is Gauder, and this means song. It comes from a word for song, which gives you an idea about what kind of magic it was. There are many. Sorry, I'm losing my place. There are many types of. There are many references to chanted spells and Gauder in the written sources left by the Vikings. But this type of magic, chanting magic, seems to have something more in common with general European traditions. So many words for magic in various different languages are connected to the word for song, which gives us an idea that these traditions are all connected. So take modern English, we have the word enchantment for magic. Well, there you have the word chant. In Latin, they had incantatio. In Greek, epode, which means a poem. In Old Irish, there's a word bricht, which simultaneously means poem and a spell. Anglo Saxons, when they referred to magic, used words that mean song, like leoth, sang, or jaldor. And the medieval German word for spell was galster, which means something sung. So where does this type of magic involving singing or chanting come from? Did it come from the classical world, like the runes themselves did? Did it come from the Romans or the Etruscans? or was it part of an older and more widespread tradition, and a general Indo-European tradition? Why is Indo-European important to this? Because the ancient Germanic peoples were part of an even older cultural group, and this is the Indo-Europeans. So like Germanic, Indo-European is a term for a group of languages. But at this time it takes in the whole of Europe, the Middle East, India and other parts of Asia. The Indo-Europeans were believed to have originated around the area of the Black Sea, so a kind of Central European area back in the Stone Age, and that they migrated and evolved over the millennia into different peoples. So from these Indo-European roots, we have, in modern terms, we have the Indians, the Iranians, the Scythians, Slavs, Balts, the Greeks, the Italics, the Celts and the Germans. They're all part of this original Indo-European group that then developed into other groups, but they have the same roots. So if their languages share a common root, then perhaps their cultures did also. You can see this most commonly in the types of Indo-European gods. For instance, there are stories about a thunderbolt hurling or a hammer hurling god in many of these cultures, which gives you an idea that their gods all came from the same archetype. And if their gods come from the same archetype, so could their magic. By the way, another name for Indo-European is Aryan, but this name has fallen out of favour since it became involved in various racist ideologies by the Nazis and other people. But the Aryans were probably originally tall, olive-skinned people with dark hair and dark eyes, not something that the white supremacists prefer to remember. Well, that wraps it up for the subjects of this film. In the next film, I'm going to look at what these written sources and these old books and manuscripts actually tell us about runic magic.